and I just don't know anybody who's as good at this as Ernest and as helpful as Robert. So thank you very much for inviting us tonight. And we're glad to be talking to all of you from these remote places. We are all together alone, and we're very happy to be here with you. So thank you for coming. Let's see, we'll start with, this is our book, Theodore Roosevelt, A Literary Life. And we're going to talk tonight about, I don't think you can talk about somebody as a writer without also being intimate. So that's what we're going to focus on this evening. Just a minute, I'm trying to get this to go. Oh, there we go, okay.
Theodore Roosevelt, good evening, everybody. We're glad to be here. Theodore Roosevelt was a man of many guises, many different roles. He was multifarious in the very best of the term. He was a cowboy, he was a historian, he was a police commissioner, he was the naval secretary, he was the Rough Rider charging up mountains, he was the governor of New York for a little while, he was the vice president, and soon thereafter became the president, the youngest president in the history of the United States. He was a peacemaker. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906, and he was a mighty hunter at the end of his life. And during all those public guises, he wrote and he read endlessly and wrote and published endlessly. He had 6 very lively and active children and not a lot of money. And so he had to make money, and he considered himself a professional writer.
This is Theodore I want you to get tonight. Believe it or not, this is 1905 when he was being the president, when he was all duded up at the White House doing various things. But when he could get away, and he's out in Colorado hunting here, this is the way he dressed. I have to tell you, I saw Tom dressed like this the other day, walking around the yard. Anyway, here he is doing what he always did when he could book. You can tell us what that is, we would love to know. He picked up a dog on this trip named Skippy. He took Skippy back to the White House with him. But whatever you want to think about Theodore Roosevelt, he's always this person from this photo.
Right. And the dog, Skippy, became in a White House full of children and pets, Skippy became the favorite and was always seen with Quentin.
As we've been talking about, and Robert was talking about, he wrote 42 books and co-authored another 6. He wrote journals and sketches. He wrote from the time he was 7, 8 years old. He wrote every day. There's so much we can know about him and his mind and his life. He wrote long histories. He was known as an historian. He wrote biographies. Mostly they managed to somehow be about him. He wrote an autobiography and various memoirs. He did travel narratives, wonderful travel narratives, hunting stories, war stories, scientific explorations, and collections of all sorts. He wrote hundreds. He was a good essay writer, by the way. He was a good reader, a good thinker about the world of language. He was a good speech writer. They were long speeches, but some of those lines are memorable, as you know.
And he was a letter writer. By his count, and this hasn't ever been verified because I don't think anybody has ever sat down at the Library of Congress and read every one of those letters. 150, not all, and some of spoken to an amanuensis, but there is a Harvard edition of 8 volumes, which subsumes about 8,000 of his letters at his best, and he is a wonderful, wonderful letter writer, as you can imagine.
I want to start, I did start with Tedie as a boy. He spelled it T-E-D-I-E, by the way. And as a boy, he's look at the eyes, he's smart, he's earnest, he cares very much about the world. He has no idea that he's nearsighted until he's 14. So he went out into the world. He loved the natural world. I think he meant to be a scientist. He was really made for that. He was an ornithologist, fascinated by birds, and especially bird song, because he didn't see so well. He was a field biologist, and if he had had the chance to study that at Harvard, that's what he would have been. As he got older and got a gun and some glasses, he would kill, of course, and collect specimens. Those specimens of his birds, by the way, you can see in New York City at the American Museum of Natural History. His daddy put up the money for that museum, and so it turned out that there's second acquisition were his bird skins. He learned taxidermy with a guy named Bell, who worked for Audubon. So he was, this was a world that opened to him. He was very excited to be in nature. And he wrote about it and thought about it every day. What happened, Tom?
I don't know.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay. So he went off to Harvard College, as I say. He was quite a dresser. He was a dandy kind of guy. He was a wealthy kid and different from other kids. Toward the end of Harvard, he started to work on his writing, and he thought about what he might be able to do with his pen. And he wrote a wonderful essay that he didn't publish. You can find this essay and read it today. It's called Southerly. And the Southerlies are a bird. And he was going hunting one day with his brother Elliot on Long Island Sound. And the Southerlies were calling to him. And that's where the story gets its title. And it's a story maybe like, you think of Stephen Crane's The Open Boat or something like that. These are two boys who think they know what they're doing. They go out and there's a nor'easter coming up, getting very cold, forbidding, but they're only worried about their hunting. So they go off to hunt for the day. They kill a loon at the beginning, which is kind of ominous. Anyway, they kill their share of birds, but the birds take the upper hand in the story, and they coax the boys farther and farther out into the dangerous waters. And when they turn around toward home, they realize because of the weather, they may have come too far. So as they barely make it back home, and the birds, of course, are out floating very carelessly and blissfully on the waters. And so there it was. He had this idea for a hunting story. He knew he liked narrative. He might have become a fiction writer. There are people who talk about how he swung a good pen. And he did. And he might have been a writer in his own. He was a writer, but he was so many other things. So he left Harvard College to go to law school and to make his way in the world. He went out to the Dakotas, and he learned about ranching. He was very interested in ranching. One thing that, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say that the cowboys out there thought he was a dude, right? And he had to defend himself. And he started getting bullied one night by one of the really mean drunks in town. And he settled. The mean drunk had no way of knowing that Roosevelt was a champion boxer at Harvard. And so the drunk came at him, and Theodore Roosevelt floored him.
So he was out, as he was out in the West, there's something that happened early on. He got married to Alice Lee, very much in love with her. He went to law school. He also went to the state legislature in Albany. And you may know this story, but he came home on February 14th on Valentine's Day in 1884. And his wife had just had their first baby, Alice. And he had come home back to New York to revel in what he thought he had control of his life. He felt very confident as he opened the door. And he was met by his brother, Elliot. And Elliot said to him, there is a curse, talk about the ghost, there's a curse on our house. And as he walked in, he realized that both his mother and his wife lay dying. They would both die over the next day. His mother, who had typhoid fever, typhus, had gone out into New York to simply walk around for the day, came home with a contagion, removal of COVID, these last few months of COVID, a virus. Anyway, she was dying of that. And his wife, who had had the baby, was discovered to have Bright's disease, and she was dying of that. So he nursed his mother downstairs, his wife upstairs. And at the end of the day he was completely without what? Any kind of cushioning for a blow like that in his life. He's a very confident man. He wrote in his diary that day with just an X. And he said, "The light has gone out of my life." And he said then, "For joy and for sorrow, my life has now been lived out." He could only say that because he was young. Anyway, what he did was to leave the daughter, Alice, with his sister, and he went back out to the Badlands to try to figure out what had happened to him. And so we see this intimate detail in these hunting stories that he would tell. He developed a kind of genre all of his own. He called it outdoor faunal naturalism, and he thought of himself that way. And so he wrote these two hunting books about hunting in the Dakotas. The first one, Hunting Trips of a Ranchman, is really just about killing. He went out and he killed everything he saw. I think in the midst of that, what he was really looking for was a way to understand death, that there could be life and that there could be death. I'm just going to read a passage from this that might give you a sense of how his personal world was expressed in his writing. He talks about, in the book's most lyrical language, Roosevelt records the music of a flock of snow buntings. One bleak March day, when the snow covered and the shaggy ponies crowded about the empty corral, a flock of snow buntings came familiarly round the cowshed, clamoring of the ridgepole and roof. Every few minutes, one of them would mount into the air, hovering about with quivering wings and warbling a loud, merry song with some very sweet notes. These lovely descriptions lessen but do not fully balance the deep sense of grief and loss in Hunting Trips of a Ranchman. It's more about landscape and loneliness than about heroic manliness as he travels on horseback to the west of the Badlands through the Grand Prairies in search of virtual nourishment, the vast stretches of the American plain echoing the writer's mood. And this is Roosevelt writing. Nowhere, not even at sea, does a man feel more lonely than when riding over the far-reaching, seemingly never-ending plains. And after a man has lived a little while on or near them, their very vastness and loneliness and their melancholy monotony have a strong fascination for him. So it's in that first book that he's trying to deal with his loss at home. The second book, this is the one people are more likely to read, I suppose, is Ranch Life and the Hunting Trail. And in that, he goes back to Southerly. He tries to create characters. He's creating Western characters. He has a lot of laughing and joking and riding and such. The story that sticks out for us is a story of two horse thieves who steal his boat. And it's in the spring, and there are dreadful winter storms around him. And he builds a boat, and he goes after the thieves. He wants to bring them to justice, but he also wants his boat back. And as he's sitting in the middle of his boat, trying to make his way through the ice to catch the thieves, he's reading Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. Yeah, that's right, Anna Karenina. And what troubles him so much, this is 2 years after his wife has died, his lovely Alice. And he's thinking he wants to get married to a childhood friend, Edith Caro. And so he picks up Tolstoy's book, and what he's trying to figure out, you see, he doesn't know if it's right for a man whose wife dies when she's young for him to ever remarry. But he's very interested in romance and, let's face it, in sex. And so Anna Karenina, there she is with all that passion, unbridled passion. And it's a hard read for him as he makes his way through the river. And you know, he comes back, of course, and marries Edith Carroll. What he's most known for as a writer is as a historian. And when he talks later about history as literature, his contribution to history is that he believes that history is told through stories, individual stories. So it's really about the lives of the people who are living it. You can do numbers, you can do figures, you can study different data points, I suppose. But he thinks that all of literature, all of good writing comes to you through story. So in history, as literature, for example, he says, well, no one would have read Darwin if he hadn't been a good writer. So he meant to be a good writer. The first book that he writes is The Naval War of 1812. And actually that's 1813, and it's in Lake Champlain. And it's about, I don't know, building boats and just, well, whatever, shooting the hell out of everybody. He got his information for that because he went to see two of his uncles. Mother was born in the South, and his uncles were Confederate heroes. And he went to, because they had to live in England after the war. And so he went to England and talked with them, and he crafted this book. So it has a lot of, again, intimacy in a story that seems to be very much not about the enemy. What he's noted for is this winning of the West. It's a long, long history in imitation of Parkman. And what it's really about, I'm gonna let Tom talk here, because it's really about Tom's people.
It's not about the far West. It's about the West in the 1790s and the 1800s and the 1810s, which meant, of course, that trans-Appalachian West of Kentucky and Tennessee and the Ohio Valley. It's about who hero the forest and who built a civilization. And he understands that they take it away from the Native Americans, but he has almost no sympathy at all for the Native Americans. He simply wants middle-class America to move straight to the Mississippi River. It's quite an exciting story, and it's beautifully written. He did a lot of revisions on his text, which he wrote with pencil on the yellow paper, but he never cut anything out. All he ever did was add more to it.
Yeah, he really always trusted a first draft. He was pretty sure that whatever he said was right. And if he was going to revise, he was going to add to it and not take away. The last story in the winning of the West, you might say, is the book you may know, The Rough Riders. It's about the Spanish-American War, that he goes to Cuba, that he goes up, actually, Kettle Hill, and it's about the sort of, I guess, the last battle in the winning of the West. He's, of course, the hero of that, and he uses countless eyes. They have to order more eyes for the typesetters. But that's a book that most people read and enjoy. It's full of natural imagery. There are a lot of personal moments also. It's that pub. At the end of it, the Rough Riders are sick, and they're sick with the.
Yeah, they're sick. They begin to get very ill. In fact, the whole army in Cuba is decimated more not by disease than by the enemy. And after the war is over, after they've won, they're still in Cuba waiting for the ships to come get them, and they start to be assailed and attacked by yellow fever, and they're desperately ill, and many of them are dying. And he simply trashes the chain of command and writes directly to the Secretary of the Navy and said, you get us out of here, and you get us out of here right now. You're going to take us to Montauk at the end of Long Island, and we'll recuperate from our diseases there. And while he's there, you can see him at his desk. He writes the book.
So if you want to know where Theodore Roosevelt would stand on the problem we now have with the captain of the Theodore Roosevelt and the coronavirus, I have to tell you that he would stand with the captain, with the men who were ill.
He announced, when he was becoming a public man, that one of his political creeds, it's also a personal writer's creed, he said, I have a horror of words that are not translated into deeds. And the first example of that was when he read Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Lives, with its pictures of the slums on the low end and the tenement houses on the Lower East Side in New York City. Roosevelt got a copy of the book. Of course, he sat down immediately and read it. He was fascinated by the book. He was fascinated by Jacob Riis, who was a Danish immigrant. He was fascinated by the photography. Riis was also a wonderful photographer. And he went directly to Riis's office and he sat down and he said, you've got to teach me about this. I have to know what the slums are really like. Will you take me there? And he did. And within a few years, of course, he's the governor of New York. And guess what he does? He writes a series of laws and makes a series of words into legal deeds, which become the disciplining of the human culture and to rescue some of these poor, suffering people. It's the beginning of his progressivism.
Progressivism, which will flower later. Let's see. What's happening here?
When one of his guises, as we saw, was governor of New York. Boy, the Republicans who dominated the state legislature didn't want to have anything to do with him. They didn't trust him. They thought he was a wild-eyed thinker and probably not even a trustworthy man. And besides which, he wouldn't do what they told him to. So they arranged with the politicians in Washington, D.C. at the National Convention, before the National Convention in 1900, they arranged to have him taken out of the governor's office in New York and put in the vice presidency, which he did not want. He knew he was being kicked upstairs. He knew he'd be bored to death. It just didn't seem to fit a man of his ferocious energies. He didn't want it. He wanted to be governor of New York, but he didn't win that one. And within 6 months, August of 1901, or 1901, McKinley is shot in Buffalo while Roosevelt and his family are vacationing in the Green Mountains of Vermont. And within 10 days, Roosevelt is the president of the United States. He immediately takes the measure of his faculty, of his cabinet, right? And he really sets the government into the 20th century in ways that were truly creative and exciting. And he wanted somehow to make the natural world as important to the American public as it was to him. So he planned a long trip in 1903. 14,000 trip. It was the longest trip an American president had ever made. It was the longest anybody had ever been away from the White House when he was supposed to be there, right? Washington always closed down in the summer times, but he took an inordinate time off. He was gone 5 months, 14,000 miles, 500 speeches, endless meetings with local politicians. But the heart of the trip to him was the stay in Yellowstone Park with John Burroughs and the stay in Yosemite which was only a California market there, with John Muir, two of the great nature writers of the time, of the world, still right now. You can read their prose with enormous pleasure and joy. Burroughs, he was very intimate with. He called him Uncle John and had spent time at the White House with him. He had looked him up, as he often did with writers he liked. And they toured Yellowstone, and he said to John, Uncle John, what are we going to do about this place? What's your best thinking? How can we straighten this out? The park was victimized by foresters who would come in and steal the forest, by hunters who came in and contracted to send huge numbers of elk to the metropolitan markets in places like Denver and Chicago. The developers wanted to get at the hotels, and he and John Burroughs talked and talked and talked, and they decided it had to be a national park. There had to be a National Park Service. It had to be different than it had ever been before, and it had to be under the aegis of the federal government. There's it for you. And he moved on to Yosemite with John Muir with the same questions about Yosemite, which was really being victimized by depredation of foresters and hunters and trespassers of all kinds, panning for gold, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was just being trashed. It was being what we call in the 21st century monetized. He had never met John Muir, and at the beginning when they were together, he was Mr. Muir, and to John Muir, Theodore Roosevelt was Mr. President. But at the end of the first night, together when they camped out, they were Theodore and John. And they came up with the idea of Yosemite for the preservation of the mountains there. And they remained pretty good friends over the course of their life until the quarrel about the Hetch-Hetchy. He gets back to Washington in toward the end of 1903, and he starts putting together a group of like-minded politicians in the House who will help him with his like-minded Boone and Crockett Club to set up preservation, an act which will allow him to preserve well, let me read the Antiquities Act and you'll see what it does, okay? And this is Roosevelt at his best. Antiquities, it's signed Roosevelt on June 8, 1906. The President of the United States is hereby authorized in his discretion, that's a phrase Roosevelt really wanted in there, to declare by public proclamation historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest that are situated upon the lands owned or controlled by the government of the United States to be national monuments. That really pleased Roosevelt, and he ended up preserving millions, hundreds of millions of acres of forests and parks. And a corollary to the Antiquities Act was the establishment of the National Park Service.
Also, at the same time that he's the President of the United States, if you can imagine such a thing, that we would have a president who would be among the second group of inductees into the American Academy of, that's a picture of him. That's the same period of time when he was with Skippy, if you want to see the difference. But again, you see as a reader and as a writer among writers. He was voted into the Academy along with Henry James by people like Mark Twain and Henry Adams. So he was at the front line of American writing. I think that's the thing we most want to emphasize in the book that we wrote. What the other thing about him is, can you imagine, I don't imagine a president was ever like this, who cared about what our literature looked like and our art. many people thought that Americans were sort of rough-hewn and inelegant, and the American language wasn't musical. And so what Roosevelt said in the face of that criticism, and he meant this because he wanted to create a country and also a literature and an art. He said American work must echo our soul. And he did reading, analyzing, and reviewing of different writers. We're going to take you through. A couple here that you may know. You may know this is Walt Whitman. Of Walt Whitman, he was kind of struck by the sexual images, probably in some of the poetry, but he was also very much attracted to things like crossing Brooklyn Ferry, and he wrote an essay called "The Dante of the Bowery," and he thought that's what we had in Whitman, was a person who went into the streets and talked about real people, and that he was our Dante.
Remember in high school when we all had to make our way through "I Hear America Singing"? Roosevelt loved that expansive love for the country that was on display in Whitman's poems. Another one of the previous generation of American writers whom he admired, whom he thought in fact worked that of our soil, was Mark Twain. He loved The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and read them to his children and took them with them everywhere. He was always carrying around Twain's novels and rereading them. He loved the language, and he loved the humor, and he loved the adventuresomeness. He didn't necessarily love Twain's politics, and Twain pretty much loathed Roosevelt's politics. But they admired each other, and they had a touchy but real friendship.
This is Booker T. Washington. His book, Up from Slavery, was the popular read as Roosevelt entered the White House. So the first writer that he invited to the White House to dinner was Booker T. Washington. African Americans had always been in the White House and in fact built the White House, but they hadn't come to dinner. And he took a lot of ferocious attack for that, but he stayed a friend. They were always in communication.
This fine fellow is Owen Wister, who wrote The Virginian. He and Theodore were buddies at Harvard, and Wister was a many-talented man, as was Roosevelt, of course, and he made his early career as a musician, as a piano player, as a classical piano player, and as a dramatist. But he became famous when he wrote a novel about the West called The Virginian. He asked Roosevelt, while Roosevelt was president, to read the manuscript. Roosevelt did. He criticized it. He recommended changes. Owen Wister made those changes. And when he published the novel, it was dedicated to his friend Theodore, President Theodore Roosevelt. It's a wonderful novel and interesting to this day. And it establishes the genre of Western fiction. And collaterally, I think it establishes the memes and the images and the themes of the American movie about all the Western movies you've ever seen in one way or another echo or subvert the images established by Owen Wister in his The Woman.
The woman up in the corner is Edith Wharton. She grew up in the same generation and the same social class in old New York in the Gilded Age, along with Theodore Roosevelt. There's probably no one who was more simpatico, who understood the world in the same ways. They knew about the malefactors of great wealth and what money had done to culture in their generation. They respected each other. They knew each other. They adored each other and respected each other.
And the final guy down in the corner proves that Roosevelt just didn't like prose or nonfiction prose. He loved poetry too. And this is Edward Arlington Robinson. His son was at Choate. He found a book by a local poet that he published himself, and he sent it to his dad. And he said, "Pop, you better read this because I think this guy is really pretty good." And Roosevelt read it, and he did think it was pretty good. And he became a patron of the arts instantly. He offered Edward Arlington Robinson, a job in the Treasury Department for $2,000 a year. It was a patronage job, pure and simple. And his patron said, "You're not to work in the Treasury Department, you're to write." And he did. And he became a major voice in early 20th century American poetry, particularly loved by Robert Frost. When he left the White House, he wanted to clear out of the country. He'd engineered William Howard Taft's election as president. He was really exhausted. And one of the things he liked to do when he was exhausted is go out and really tire himself out by physical activity. So he arranged an elaborate safari to Africa, 14 months. It was sponsored by Andrew Carnegie funded it, and it was sponsored by the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. He was to gather specimens for their collections with it. They were on the road. He made a deal before he left with Scribner's, which was a publisher he had used regularly in the course of the preceding 10 or 15 years, to write magazine articles. He was going to write 12. He would produce them and send them along by runner to a port, and they would be shipped to the United States. Scribner's would typeset them along with photographs taken by Kermit, and they would become articles in Scribner's magazine. And then when the 12 novels, the 12 chapters were done, they would be produced in a book, unchanged, with the titles of the chapters unchanged, called Hunting Tales from Africa, I think. I can't remember right now.
It's a bestseller.
It was a best-selling novel or a best-selling book, and Roosevelt was pretty famous for it, right? And there's an interesting story here.
The little red is there before and show the eyes is all that the pronunciation.
Here he is, one of his vast rhinoceros. He killed 203 large animals, had them skinned and the bones preserved and packaged up and shipped back to the Smithsonian, and the specimens are still there to this day and are extremely useful to contemporary scientists, believe it or not, because now they have evidence of the DNA from 1910.
That's astonishing. Yeah.
And it's real. It's an important. It wasn't just a vacation, or it wasn't just an excuse to blast away at things. It was for a writer's trip who was a hunter and a story of hunting, if you like them. Right.
He came back from that trip and decided he wanted to be president again. And as you may know, he was a third-party candidate for the Progressive Party. He wanted the Republican. He wanted to get the presidency from Taft, and he wanted the Republican nomination. And he was beaten out by the guys at the convention in the back room, and that made him angry. And so he, as you know, became the head of the Bull Moose campaign, very famously. It did a whole lot to make him angry and irritated, so that when he came to write his autobiography, and if you pick that up, you might find there are some personal places where he's talking his life in the beginning, but then he quickly switches to his anger about what had happened in the campaign. Couldn't give it up. one section called Indoors and Outdoors. Isn't that right, Tom?
Yes, right.
And
yeah.
that's where you'll find the most, the guy that you'll probably like the best.
He really was disgruntled after that defeat for two reasons. He didn't ever like to lose anything, first place. Second place, he understood that he'd really made a mistake and he had turned the national government over to the Democratic Party, which he didn't trust and didn't very much like. And he really, well, he's a Harvard man and Woodrow Wilson was a Princeton man, and I think they had a natural antagonism toward one another. But at any rate, he was unhappy. So he cleared out and he went to South America, not only to make a little money, speaking to the governments of Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, but to do a tour, a hunting tour of the Amazon River and later the Orinoco River in Venezuela. It turned out he didn't do that. He was offered a job in Brazil, or a chance in Brazil, to explore an unknown river called the Rio de Duvida in the Mato Grosso in northwestern Brazil with Cândido Rondon, a national hero of Brazil. And he jumped at the chance. It made Edith mad. It made the Smithsonian Institute, who were financing him, made them mad, made scared everyone because they thought this is not a wise thing for a 55-year-old fat man to do, go off and explore an unknown river. But he said, and he said it loudly, and he just was going to carry the day, it's my last chance to be a boy. So he left with Rondon and they went down the Rio Duvida, and he wrote a book about it called Through the Brazilian Wilderness. It's a remarkable book and I recommend it to you heartily. It's written on the same style Africa book. It's chapter by chapter by chapter, published first in Scribner's and then as a book. And it's really quite exciting. And Roosevelt very nearly dies. And instead of weighing 220 pounds that he weighed when he left on the trip, when he got to the boat, he weighed 160 pounds and was just about to die. He recovered fast. And he carried the fevers that he had contracted there and the various diseases. He carried them with him for the rest of his life. It's an interesting book, and it does have some wonderful nature writing.
Oh, that's
right.
Why don't you
No,
I'll read it at the end.
I'll read it at the end.
It's the Great War that really does him in. He thought about manly valor and the battlefield. He sent all of his sons off to the war. You see, this is Edith Wharton in Paris, and you see his son Quentin, his son Archie, and his son-in-law Dick Derby. Wharton was working for the war effort in Paris. But in the war, as you know, he lost his son Kermit, and it simply broke his heart. He was a pilot and a heroic fellow, and he died. And it took the wind really out of the man. He was dead within 6 months.
Theodore, his son Theodore was there, and he was wounded. His son Kermit was there, and he was wounded. And Archibald carried his wounds with him to his grave. Archie was really lucky to be alive. But the death of Quentin sort of humanized him in a way. His bluster about how heroic it was to go off and fight, he learned maybe wasn't applicable to the wars in the 20th century, and it certainly hadn't been for his son Kermit. His son Quentin, who was both his favorite and his wife Edith's favorite. This volume, he does his last book review for the New York Times of a book by a scientist called Beebe who had written a book called The Natural World, right? And he said, he read it at night after bombing missions over Germany and Belgium in the war. He was sickened by the war, and so he wrote this book and Roosevelt reviews it for the New York Times.
This is the last thing.
This is one of the very last things he writes. Roosevelt, crippled by grief and worry, reads Beebe's words with compassion and finally with a sense of forgiveness and deep understanding. This volume was written when the writer's soul was sick of the carnage which has turned the soil of northern France into a red desert of horror. To him, the jungle seemed peaceful, and the underlying war among its furtive dwellers but a small thing compared to the awful contest raging in France. It is the same feeling that makes strong men who have sickened of the mean and squalid injustice of so much life turn with longing to the waste places where no paths penetrate the frowning or smiling forests and no keels furrow the lonely rivers. That's a particularly striking phrase, it seems to me, that the World War I now to Roosevelt was the red desert of horror.
Okay, so we would like to take your questions now, if there are questions.
Great. So Catherine, I do have a question that was sent in. People often quote Teddy Roosevelt's famous "The Man in the Arena" speech. Could you elaborate on the origins of this speech? Was it a campaign speech?
Oh, that's interesting. He gives the Men in the Arena in Paris, and he comes up out of Africa and he gives a series of wonderful addresses where he tells everybody what to do. And when he gets to Paris, he decides he's going to give this speech to the Parisians. He's going to talk to the women there about how it's a good idea for women to have babies. They found him, sometimes amusing. But it's a wonderful speech. I think it's a speech maybe to get out at this hour when we think about the world we live in, where we're all at each other right now, and now we're all home because of this virus. And I think the idea of it's the man in the arena, it's the person who's really out there fighting for things. And it's easy to jeer and it's easy to stand back, but we owe allegiance to people, especially the people today who are out in this COVID environment doing so much for us in the arena.
And keeping us all safe and
he
healthy.
would admire that. That's right.
It was given at the Sorbonne to the leading French intellectuals of the time. William James was there. I think maybe Henry James was there. Edith Wharton was certainly there.
Edith Wharton's boyfriend was there.
Oh, Edith.
Would-be boyfriend.
Right, okay. And the Frenchmen were the French audience was sort of blown away by the passion and the beautiful language that Roosevelt had written for the occasion. It wasn't a campaign speech because he wasn't campaigning for anything, except his status as a leading statesman and thinker on the world stage.
I really think it represents his political writing at its best. And that's probably why you think of it as a political speech.
Right. And he wrote it. He knew when he was in the White House that he was going to Africa on the safari. And he knew he was going to give this speech when he got to Khartoum and came up the Nile to Cairo and then to Italy and then to France. He knew he had been invited to give this speech on a certain. So he wrote it at the end of his frantic career as president, which was the last 6 months of his presidency were really, really clotted with action. I mean, he did a million things, but he also wrote that speech because he had it ready a whole year and a half in advance. Don't we wish our students could do something like that?
And is it a political speech? I do think he thought he would be president in 2020 had he not died. So he was always a political animal, that's true.
Right, not right. We know what you mean. So Nancy had a question. Are these books available in the town libraries? Are they still in print? I can field some of this. Nancy, we do own several books that are sort of collections of Theodore Roosevelt's writings. One book we own is called, appropriately enough, The Man in the Arena, The Selected Writings of Theodore Roosevelt. We also have a book called American Bears, Selections from the Writings of Theodore Roosevelt. And yes, we do own a copy of Thomas and Catherine's book as well. And certainly via interlibrary loan, which we hope to have starting up within the next couple of weeks, we will once again have access to all the other libraries' collections as well.
I believe in books, and I believe that we should go out and buy books. Much of Roosevelt's writing has been digitized by Dickinson State University at the Theodore Roosevelt Center. So you can read some of his letters and things. If you're in a mood to get to know, you can find various documents.
There are 2 volumes in the Library of America series of Roosevelt's writings that are available as well. And it's on that thin Bible paper, and they're really huge, but they're not very heavy.
In the chat, I'm putting a link to the Theodore Roosevelt Center that Catherine just referenced from, what is it, Dickinson State University. So there's the link. It's TheodoreRooseveltCenter.org, and it does appear that a lot of his letters and some of his other writings have been digitized. So that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
That's right. In these days when we're all at home, that's a good thing. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Dickinson State's only a few miles away from Medora, where his ranch was. And there is a Theodore Roosevelt National Park in Medora, which has the ranch property on it. The house is gone, but they're going to rebuild the house and place it in the entrance to the national park sometime in the next few years.
Very cool, very cool. So we're at 8 o'clock. Does anyone else have any questions for Catherine or Thomas? I'm not seeing any. So that being the case, let's wrap it up. Thomas, Catherine, any last words to the group?
Yes. Yes, you can buy our book on Amazon. And we thought in these COVID days when we're so much at home, that you might have a book club that would like to do the book. And if you would like us to do a Zoom for you and maybe talk about individual things like the Man in the Arena speech and other things, you can get a hold of me at my university address. It's there on the screen. We would be pleased to talk with you in these ways.
So Catherine, I'll pass that along to some of the book clubs in the area and some of the surrounding libraries, okay?
You would love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so let me unmute everyone so we can thank Catherine and Thomas for tonight's talk. I'm gonna unmute you all on 3, and then we can say thank you. Let me stop recording at this point though, before I do that, okay?